Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Cobra Eagle, and welcome. Today, we attempt to keep our Japanese macaque from escaping while averting a dingo disaster. Hope you enjoy. Let's get building. Last time we were here, we had a pretty significant problem. One that could have been solved if we would have checked the item tags, which are keywords about each of the items in the game. In particular, we had an item here that allowed us to, or allowed the animal actually, to climb on the object. So the sandstone columns that I was using had a tag called climbable that lets them escape. And so we can see that not only the defense that we created last episode, but also the castle barriers as a whole are not terribly conducive to animals that can climb. So we spend a lot of time here trying to figure out ways to keep the animals from getting onto climbable objects. This is where the game gets a little bit squirrely, I would say, because as you try to cover these things up, it's really kind of a all or nothing type deal. If the animal can get a hold of any part of that climbable object, they will still be able to climb it. Now, we did solve a lot of this along the edge of the barrier, which, spoiler alert. However, there's still a lot of stuff that we end up having to do on the actual castle wall to try to fix that. And right here is where we actually spend a little bit of time trying a couple of different things to see maybe what we can do to keep the animal from being able to climb up onto that uh, the wall, the castle wall, because there's a sandstone column light on its side on the bottom there, and then we have two that are upright. And we're going to see here that we have to go through some pretty extreme lengths to get this. And I don't even know that we get it right here. It might take a little bit of time, but we're already having animals escaping and everything else. And so a lot of this was just trying to see like where can we put things that would keep the animal from being able to climb on it, so on and so forth, trying a different tactic here just to see what might work. And unfortunately, like I said, it's really kind of like an all or nothing type thing. If the animal can even grab a hold of any part of that climbable object, they're going to be able to climb across a good amount of it, or even more so through it, which is even more frustrating because that's something that could still lead to having animals escape if we have that as a continual issue where we do that. So the ultimate goal is going to be to get rid of all of those green lines. As we were going through and checking various things, we also were letting it play because we needed to see the traversable area update. And then we had a little bit of a dingo disaster. So our dingoes did mate because the adults couldn't escape, but the juveniles are typically much smaller models. And so they have the ability to get around places that the adults can't. And that was exactly what happened here. So we were dealing with escaped Japanese macaque animals, and then one of them was a dingo. And I was like, what is going on? We have an escaped animal here, and found out that it was a juvenile. And so now we're working through and trying to fix this. Uh, you can see that as we kind of zoom out, we can see a lot of uh, potential escape points. And we go through a lot of different things here to try to solve this problem because right now, as it stands, the animals, the adults anyway, can't get through the foliage or over the rocks or whatever. Another thing that you have to consider with a lot of the animals is they do have some ability to jump. Now, like the dingoes, that little like 1 meter tall fence that I have that keeps them in, keeps them from being able to get out. Now, could they potentially jump over a 3 foot fence? Maybe, maybe not. However, your primates and stuff like that can definitely jump over taller objects. And that's something that we're going to see as a problem as we continue to work with the Japanese macaque a little later on. Now, here we're getting things that give indication that the animal can escape, but it doesn't make any sense as to where the animal seems to be able to escape from because we don't even see those icons until we get further away. So we just keep adding and building and changing and adding and building and changing here in an effort to try to see what we can do to keep them from escaping. And eventually we figure out that there is a completely different path they can take that we didn't expect. And we'll see that hopefully here pretty soon. But we end up building some pretty sizable rock formations to keep the animals from being able to jump because again that was one of the things that I was trying to prevent was the animals being able to jump over objects and climb out that way. That was the current working theory that I had going through this. We'd already put some more foliage up as a way to maybe keep them from going through that because oftentimes the animals can't traverse through some of the more pronounced foliage. Now, some of your smaller things like bracken or whatever, they can climb right through. But if you start using like elephant grass, reed stands, so on and so forth, it's a little bit different. So we're still having those same issues. And at this point, it was like, I don't know what's going on. Let's just go ahead and delete it and investigate and see what else we can find. Because it was getting to a point where we were just building a bunch of different things and it just wasn't happening. We tried rocks. Now we're going to try foliage and see if that works. Spoiler alert, that doesn't work either. And again, we can only see those if we zoom really, really far out. And now, one of the things that is really important, and this is how we were able to discover this, because you can see here, it's actually underground. It might be a little hard to see because the camera is moving so fast, but it's effectively on top of objects that are buried under the ground as the animal can crawl around and get out that way. I wasn't even able to identify where they could get in. So I then just started taking rocks, putting them down along the edge. They're not even visible on the surface. And this was just a way to keep the animals from being able to get across that traversable area. Because if it is something that's considered traversable, the game is somehow going to let the animals actually be able to get there. So we were able to solve that and keep the animals in that particular habitat. We were able to get rid of a lot of the extra foliage that we put in and everything else, and that really made things better. There was also a little area over here, which I don't have a problem with. I expected that it would be an issue. And so we were able to put like one rock down, and then just as the terrain updated, one of the juveniles was running over there to try to escape, and we fixed it. It's just one of those things that is extremely frustrating sometimes when dealing with like or your own man-made barriers, especially when you're dealing with climbable animals, whatever. The one reason that we were able to discover that problem is because I have a setting that allows the camera to go through the terrain. And if you go into your settings, there's an option where you can, I think it's under the camera tab, you can scroll all the way to the bottom and then it'll say disable camera collision with the terrain. And then it allows the camera to move up underneath. There's a couple of reasons why that's really useful. First off, you can let the camera get way closer to the ground that way. And so if you're trying to line stuff up along the ground or whatever, it lets the camera like move down there. And then also you can clearly go underground, which is also an extremely useful tool and something that I'll have to keep in mind in the future as I run into dealing with those kinds of situations in the if they ever crop up again, where we are dealing with animals that can escape through some method or mechanism that doesn't seem like it can make a lot of sense. So here you can see that we were able to get the wall section taken care of finally along the bottom. But what you're going to notice is that the pillars that are upright still seem to have green on them. Now, part of it is potentially that the animal can get up from some point here or some point there and crawl up and then back down. But as we continue to go through this, I think another part of the problem is the animal is capable of jumping. And because the animal is capable of jumping, they can jump up over and grab the climbable object and then just climb that way. So there's still a lot of things that end up making it that Yeah, you can see there, like, along the upper portions that it still seems like they can get a hold, even though down below, it doesn't look like there's anywhere that they can grab. So, there's gonna be a lot of other stuff that we do to kind of block all of that, but it's something else that even just preparing this video and kind of reviewing, it was things that I was thinking about, like, what else could we do to keep the animals from being able to get a hold of the edges and being able to kind of climb out. So we have a decent solution for our main barrier, and all it is taking a piece of plaster, which is not climbable, turning it into a color that kind of fits with our general look here, and then using it to cover up the edges just barely. Now, if we had maybe moved the discs up a little bit, or we could even have grabbed the pillars and moved them down, or technically even deleted them really, other than it does provide a little bit of context or a little bit of the object in the center where the animal can't get. And I'm still not even 100% that this isn't going to be still a climbable escape point. But later on in the video, we do let it run a little more and we tend to have less escapes. And the only escapes that we seem to have are really along some of the castle wall edges that we didn't necessarily address everything there completely because, again, it took until editing this video for me to kind of figure out what it was that might be the problem. And that's one thing that while I love this game, and it might just be that there's so many possibilities that it just isn't feasible to really give the kind of feedback that would make it easy to solve some of these problems. But the game doesn't necessarily give you a lot of feedback. And here, I mean, it gives you feedback that the animal can get out, and I get that. It's not necessarily going to tell me necessarily how to fix it. So I understand that. Where I'm really kind of talking about is with things like paths, where it'll say like invalid terrain or invalid path placement or something, but it doesn't tell you that the reason why is because water's in the way, or another path is in the way, or too close, or something like that. You just kind of have to, through trial and error, figure out what might be the problem. There's no particular examples in this video, but if you've ever watched any of my other Twitch live streams, because we haven't really dealt with too much of it at all in this particular zoo. You won't see too much of it, at least right now. However, that is still something that's kind of a big issue, and so it's components like that that would be nice that even if it didn't give you like exactly like what it was, that part of the tooltip or in the help section or something like that, when it gave you that particular error, that it said that it could be due to water placement or the proximity to another path, or even the proximity to other objects that don't let the path go through it. So, for instance, a keeper hut, a staff or staff building of any kind, shops, all of those kind of things. Also, the path cannot go through, and therefore it is something that will still generate that error. And so it's those little things that can really end up causing you to spend a lot of time to do troubleshooting, which is exactly what we did. We spent a lot of time troubleshooting this as we went through. As you saw, we did do some rock work along the edge to kind of cover up where the square edges were kind of split apart a little bit to make sure that it still looked fairly nice. And then just because we already have this entire fence kind of set up, even though it was outside the habitat and the animals couldn't necessarily climb there, we went ahead and made sure that the animals still couldn't climb there as a way to keep it consistent across the entire barrier, because this barrier here is probably the only time that I'll use this barrier ever again in my entire Planet Zoo career, because it was such a pain. Of all the hours, and I think I have upwards of 800 hours in the game, I have never had this significant of a problem in keeping the animals inside the habitat. And a lot of it was just a significant oversight on my part with not checking those tags. And I know that's the third time I've mentioned that in this video, but that's just how important it really can be when you're building objects. I just never thought that a sandstone pillar could be climbable. If I had used the climbable logs that are clearly labeled climbable logs as in the habitat tab, or even just logs in the logs, ropes, something like that, that are part of the standard objects that we use under the construction tab, I would have been a little bit more apt to believe that. But considering most of the sandstone stuff isn't climbable in any way, I just didn't expect that it was. And I failed to check that. So that's always something to kind of keep in mind as you go through this and do these things, that you can save yourself a whole lot of work by using the information the game does give you before you start building something that I think looks really, really good, but ends up not being functional in the proper way. When I typically play this game, especially when I early on, I did take a very functional kind of approach to it. Was I would use just the standard habitat barriers, and it was, is it keeping the animals in? Yep, and move on. I wasn't really concerned about the form. I was really concerned only about function. However, now with all of the hours I have in, and I want to keep that creativity up, I do definitely want to focus on form more than function, because function, it's effectively just a checklist of, can the animal escape? No. Okay, great. But the form component does allow us a lot of flexibility in how it kind of looks. So now we go through and just as due diligence, we go through and double check to make sure that everything's good. We have a couple of other possible escape points. So here, and I don't really know what exactly that it was. So I just readjusted those, moved them up, and everything seemed to be okay. I just made sure there were no green lines at all on the interior perimeter of the little wall sections that we have here, just to make sure that hopefully the animals can't escape. I can't even guarantee that, but either way. Now, with this particular uh, pillar, the animal can still get a hold of it. And so, because they can still get a hold of it, they can climb up it, over it, and out. So, I needed to put another object there. So, the sandstone, the small column, is not climbable for whatever reason. But in order to keep it consistent, I would go back later and do like the rusted color objects to keep it looking a little bit nicer. At least I think I do. I might not. That might actually stay that way, and we just leave it alone. But now we're moving on to actually building the habitat out, giving them more climbable area, because obviously all of the climbable area that we had or originally had anyway, was something that was, working for the animals. However, it's not something that we really want. Now, obviously, here we're using climbable materials, which is something that's dangerous again, because we're putting a climbable material against something that's climbable. And so the animal can potentially climb up, out, and over. And so these are things that we're still not going to end up getting completely finished in this video, but there's still a lot of potential troubleshooting that we have to take care of as we go through here. So I wanted to make a little ladder type object here that just looked like it was something that could be climbable for the animals, even though they can just grab a hold of those side pillars and just walk right up. Also, even though again the animals will just straight up climb on these and them anyway, I do like to put like little railings around just to make it seem as if we're trying to keep it safe for the animal, and that they can't just like be rough and tumble and just fall off. Not that they'll actually fall off, but just from an actual perspective, you still want this to be something that could be safe and not allow the animals to actually get hurt. And so we spend a little bit of time kind of working with that, trying to get that squared away. And because the pillars that we were using before are climbable, we might as well just go ahead and use those to kind of incorporate that into the rest of the habitat. I don't actually bother taking out the pillars that are on the inside, just simply because it didn't really make a lot of sense to go through and take those out, because they're covered up anyway. And as long as the animal can still climb around, I don't really mind them being in there. I think if I had thought through it beforehand, I probably would have done it where I took them out, but it was just easier to leave it as it was and just kind of like move on and go from there. But we have this serves kind of two purposes here. It adds more climbable area, but then it also creates a hard shelter. You could see that little guy there had actually kind of slipped through some other objects and wasn't able to or was able to get out. Now, interestingly enough, we talk about the item tags. This particular object, the forage feeder, has an item tag for this species. However, it doesn't actually act as food enrichment for this animal. So we have something that is we should have known is climbable. We looked at the tags, it's climbable, and didn't take that into consideration. But then we're using a forage feeder that is considered useful for this animal from an enrichment perspective. However, they don't actually get any enrichment off of it, which is frustrating. So I ended up taking it out and moving on to other objects that they did consider as an enrichment item. So now here, this is something that I got. The Steam store front page showed a particular little like bridge kind of thing, and I was like, I wonder if I could replicate something like that in one of my zoos that might make some sense. And so I wanted to go ahead and do this and just see exactly like what it would look like and how it kind of play out. And I think it works out pretty well, especially with climbable animals, that I didn't have to get too concerned about how much traversable area, like the blue, was on the edges because they could just climb over everything. But we end up building this nice little kind of like path that puts the animals down a little bit lower, that they're still able to kind of climb and be maybe a little bit more at the like raised up off the ground, so children aren't necessarily having to bend down or adults don't have to like look down and potentially like injure one of the animals. This is a place where the animal can be where they're still kind of safe, and it provides a little bit of a barrier, as it were, and we still let it get really really close, almost like a petting zoo type thing, but it still ends up being a really nice bridge as we kind of go through here. And we do a lot of different iterations, or not iterations, but a lot of different things to kind of add some aesthetic appeal to it and keep it looking nice while still solving some of the form problems that I wanted to address. Where when you take two of the 4 meter log paths and you twist them, now you have them kind of butted up against each other and there's some overlap. It's not the end of the world that it was overlapping. Oh, yep. So up there, you can see where that dude jumped, and he jumped from the shelter that we created over to the wall. So even though he couldn't correct, or directly climb, it forced us to have to solve yet another issue, and this is where we got distracted because as we were building something else and letting the game play, I saw that out of the corner of my eye, and that dude literally just jumped from the uh, climbable shelter onto the edge. So we have to basically take a lot of this iron, or well, yeah, rusted iron is what I would probably consider it, and cover up a lot of those edges. And it actually ends up looking really cool, in my opinion. And something I was thinking that maybe we could do along the entire castle wall. However, it would just be such a pain at this point to actually go through and do this, that I don't know that I'm going to, even though I really do think that adds a lot of extra interest and look to a lot of it. And so you can see that as we keep clicking the objects and keep seeing like what the animals may or may not be able to climb on, we have to keep adding more to keep them from being able to get there. And again, part of it's from a climbing perspective, and part of it's just that they are able to jump from one thing to another. And so it ends up being really nice there. We do the same thing over here, and this is part of it just because they may or may not be able to get there. We still just do it to make it look consistent along the entire edge, and then we're able to get this a lot of these green lines kind of under control. However, not all of the green lines end up being something that we get rid of in this particular episode. So there's probably still a little bit more work to do. It's likely that the next time that I work on this, it'll be a live stream, and I hopefully you guys are able to catch that. But if not, it'll still be on YouTube, so it'll still be a video that we can look at some point or you can look at some point in the future. So I think we got a good amount of that taken care of after we got our little escapee problem taken care of. And now we just need to finish out a lot of this because the idea behind this episode was solve the escaping problem and then try to get the habitat to be complete, or at least mostly complete. I don't think it's 100% complete, but it's something that we can still kind of work with. Because the animals, part of it, the problem too, was the animals were just getting extremely upset. They didn't have anything. And then every time I click, like, let it play for a minute and let it update, it's just a, even though it's just a few, like, in or real life seconds here or there, the animals seem to poop quite a bit. And the habitat is extremely dirty. I still don't think I actually have had a keeper come into this habitat to fix that because I need to fix that staff stuff. And again, that was something I didn't take care of with this particular episode. So that'll probably be the first order of business the next time that I work on this, is so we can have that taken care of and keep our animals from being able to uh, have that as an issue, keep them happy, because we have all of the stuff that we need to keep the animals happy. We just need to actually go through and do that. So at this point now, this bridge is starting to get a lot easier. You can see that I added those little logs kind of between each of the main sections. And then part of that too was that it helped kind of make the little support pillars feel a little bit more like they were doing something instead of it just being like this log just straight up attached to it. There's a log that comes out and it creates like a triangular frame that would give it some actual support. So we just take this around and we just kind of work it over the water, and then we bring it back down to the ground eventually. And that way the animals can kind of use it in both directions. And we just then kind of tighten that up and get everything else along it moving, because we can take our little support pillar there and we can just start moving it around and get it in place along that. And I'm doing these every two just because I think if we did it every one, it would get really kind of busy. And in all reality, I think from even an engineering perspective, and I'm no engineer by any means, but I think even from an engineering perspective, it would probably be enough to support at least the weight of these smaller animals. Now, if we had people or something else much heavier walking on that, first off, it'd probably need to be wider, but then I don't think it would be as structurally sound as it might be for something that's much smaller and much lighter. But we go through and we get this kind of taken care of, and we add little the little like 1 meter log piece that goes across it, just to cover up all the little connection points as well, just to make it consistent. And we've checked the traversable area multiple times on this just to make sure that the animals can still either climb or walk over it. And that was part of the reason for doing this too, was like I had seen this as a uh something not definitely not exactly like this. I think it was like a red panda habitat, but it was still something that I was like, I wonder if I can create something kind of akin to it. But then it also does serve a purpose in that it does provide our animals climbable things to climb on, which is what we needed to kind of solve without building necessarily like a new climbing frame or something along those lines. And so that was kind of the idea, was that it was a climbing frame, as it were, that the animal could then use. So we're going to go through here and start working on the terrain. One of the things that I think is interesting is that the animal only needs about like 15 or 20% terrain. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the entire thing has to be covered almost, and like a good portion of it has to have snow on it for it to count, which is kind of frustrating because you have so much snow that everything else is just not there. Now, the other thing about having an animal, or having a habitat where the guests can pass through, and an animal that is cold, is the guests are going to get cold unless you adjust the temperature to be something that the animals are still willing to accept and the guests don't complain. I think I've had things as low as 15, and you might even be able to go a little bit lower, maybe like to 12 or even 10 Celsius, and the guests not complain about being too cold. But I think anything below that, they're going to just whine about it. The problem is that I have the snow leopards below, but then I also need to make sure that I have snow there. And in order to have snow, It has to be 0 or lower because that's the freezing point of water, and snow will melt at anything above that. And the game is very particular about it. If it's 1 degree, it'll melt. If it's 0 degrees, it'll stay. So we had to kind of work through that as we went through this. Now we're going through and getting the decorations done to try to make the habitat look a lot more realistic. The good thing is the species allows us to put a lot of foliage in here, so we can really kind of go crazy. I don't think we go too nuts on it, but it might be something that I add more next episode. And we still have a lot that we can do along the edges of the barrier on the side where the guests are outside the path, because there's a gap there, and we'll definitely can fill it in with foliage that benefits this animal. The big thing is you'll notice that there's like a little bit of a gap kind of in the middle of the habitat, because that's where the snow leopard habitat is directly below it. And when it's directly below, it's not something that we can do anything with because now it counts for both habitats. I don't want it to count for both habitats because my snow leopards are already kind of maxed out. So I need to make sure that I take that into consideration as well. There's just a quick little thing that I needed to adjust because I think they could jump and grab a lower portion of that. So I wanted to go ahead and fix that. And I just saw that. But we have a really good amount of this stuff done now, and it's working out extremely well. Just kind of taking a look at different things. Again, doing rock work along the edges of the rock area here, or of the just the basic terrain, to get it to look a little less procedurally generated. Because again, you can just see kind of the triangles where the game is creating like the terrain shape and whatnot, and it doesn't always look that nice or realistic. But if you add in a lot of this stuff, and so we use a mixture of like the temperate rocks and the snow rocks or the snow covered rocks to kind of create an overall like look. Now, since we're in grasslands, it's never going to snow here. However, if it was an environment where we did get snow, it would cover everything with snow. And like the snow leopards, the Japanese macaque, they don't care about how much snow. So it would actually cover everything, like all the terrain with snow, and it would look pretty cool. Just going to finish up a few more rocks here, and then this will be where we end today's video. Next time, we should be getting in here, finishing up the rest of the decorations, as well as making sure that there's no other climbable escape points. Hopefully you liked today's video. Please consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell, and also drop a like on the video on your way out the door. Thank you very much, and have a great day.